Spring awakened the hills above the Bosphorus as Emperor Constantine stood where Asia and Europe nearly touched, surveying a landscape that would soon become the stage for one of history's greatest transformations. The morning mist rose from the narrow strait below, revealing fishing boats that had worked these waters since time immemorial. Before him sprawled the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, its modest fortifications and weathered temples bearing the patina of 7 centuries of existence. Merchants from distant lands walked its streets, their camels and donkeys laden with goods that spoke of trade routes stretching from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. Constantine saw beyond this present reality to a grander vision, a Rome reborn that would outlast the marble monuments of the eternal city itself. His weathered hands traced the air as he gestured to his advisors, describing palaces that existed only in his imagination and forums that would eclipse those of his predecessors. This vision was born of both pragmatism and divine inspiration, for Constantine claimed that Christ himself had appeared to him in dreams, commanding the creation of a Christian capital. The emperor's decision to establish his seat here reflected the empire's changing center of gravity with mathematical precision. Rome had grown unwieldy, its senators too steeped in pagan tradition, its people too attached to the old gods who had supposedly granted victory to their ancestors. The western capital streets echoed with complaints about taxation, while its citizens demanded ever more elaborate entertainments and free grain distributions. Real wealth now flowed eastward through Egyptian granaries, Chinese silk caravans, and Indian spice merchants who counted their profits in gold solidi. At this narrow strait where the Black Sea met the Mediterranean, where caravans from Persia encountered ships from Greece, Constantine would build not merely another urban center, but the beating heart of a Christian empire. The location offered natural harbors that could shelter entire fleets, while the Golden Horn provided a secure anchorage protected from both storms and enemies. Control of the Bosphorus meant control of trade between Europe and Asia, a source of revenue that could fund armies and monuments for generations to come. Ceremonies both ancient and revolutionary accompanied the beginning of construction on that fateful spring day in 330. Walking the boundaries of his future capital on the 11th of May, Constantine traced out fortifications that would encompass 7 hills in conscious imitation of Rome. Where Roman priests might have sacrificed white bulls to Jupiter and Mars, Christian bishops blessed the foundations with holy water and sacred relics brought from Jerusalem itself. The emperor himself carried a spear as he marked the city's boundaries, walking for hours under the Mediterranean sun while thousands of workers and citizens followed in procession. Above construction sites where countless laborers toiled to realize their sovereign's dream flew the labarum, the Chi-Rhu standard that had appeared to Constantine in his vision before the Battle of Milvian Bridge. This sacred banner, adorned with gold and precious stones, proclaimed to all who saw it that this would be a Christian city, blessed by the God who had granted Constantine victory over his rivals. Ancient pagan rituals were carefully adapted to Christian purposes, as priests sprinkled holy water where their predecessors might have poured wine libations to earth spirits. Breathtaking speed characterized the rise of this imperial creation, as if divine providence itself accelerated the work. Constantine stripped treasures from throughout the ancient world to adorn his project, sending agents to every corner of the empire with imperial mandates that could not be refused. From Delphi came the serpent column, bronze testimony to Greek victory over the Persians at Plataea, its 3 intertwined serpent heads gleaming in their new home within the hippodrome. Statues of gods and heroes from throughout the empire were transported by ship and wagon train to grace the forums and squares of the rising city. Egyptian obelisks joined Roman columns in creating a skyline that proclaimed this place heir to all civilizations that had come before. Master craftsmen from Alexandria worked alongside architects from Rome, their combined expertise creating structures that surpassed anything previously attempted. No expense was spared in creating institutions worthy of this grand vision. Sprawling across terraces overlooking the Sea of Marmara, the great palace complex displayed halls adorned with mosaics depicting both classical mythology and Christian symbolism in unprecedented harmony. Larger even than Rome's Circus Maximus, the Hippodrome could accommodate 100,000 spectators who came to cheer the chariot races, that remained the empire's most popular entertainment. The Senate House rose to accommodate senators loyal to Constantine's vision, rather than ancient traditions, its marble facade symbolizing the definitive break with pagan Rome. Yet neither palace nor circus formed the crown jewel of Constantine's creation, but rather the forum that bore his name. At its center stood a porphyry column 120 feet high, topped by a colossal statue of the emperor himself, radiating sunbeams like Apollo, but bearing the cross of Christ. Within this column, Constantine placed the most sacred relics he could gather from across the Christian world. Pieces of the true cross, nails from the crucifixion, fragments of the manger from Bethlehem, even the axe with which Noah had supposedly built his ark. The message was unmistakably clear to all who witnessed these ceremonies. This was not merely a political capital, but a holy city, the earthly reflection of the heavenly Jerusalem promised in Scripture. The transformation of Constantine's ambitious vision into urban reality required more than imperial decree. Throughout the 4th century, Constantinople evolved from a construction site into the beating heart of a reborn Roman Empire, its growth shaped by strategic geography, imperial patronage, and the relentless flow of Mediterranean commerce. The city's position at the crossroads of Europe and Asia proved even more advantageous than Constantine had envisioned. Ships carrying grain from Egypt, silk from China, spices from India, and amber from the Baltic all passed through the narrow straits that Constantinople commanded. The Golden Horn, that magnificent natural harbor, became a forest of masts as merchants from every corner of the known world sought to profit from the city's unprecedented growth. Within decades of its founding, the population had swelled beyond all expectations. Artisans, scholars, administrators, and fortune seekers flooded into the new capital, drawn by imperial favor and commercial opportunity. The Emperor Constantius Secari, Constantine's son, continued his father's building program with characteristic ambition. Where Constantine had laid foundations, Constantius erected monuments that would define the city's character for centuries to come. The great palace complex expanded across terraced gardens overlooking the Sea of Marmara, its halls and courtyards rivaling anything Rome had ever possessed. The Hippodrome, that great arena where emperors would display their magnificence to the people, hosted chariot races that became the passion of the entire population. Blue and green factions competed with such intensity that their rivalries often spilled into the streets, creating a democratic energy that distinguished Constantinople from the more subdued atmosphere of old Rome. The death of Theodosius I in 395 marked a watershed moment that would define Constantinople's destiny for the next 1,000 years. The Roman Empire, that vast dominion stretching from Scotland to the Sahara, proved too unwieldy for any single ruler to govern effectively. When Theodosius divided his realm between his two sons, Arcadius receiving the east and Honorius the west, he created a permanent split that elevated Constantinople from provincial capital to the seat of an independent empire. This division proved fortuitous for the eastern capital. While barbarian invasions devastated the western provinces, Constantinople remained secure behind its strategic position and growing defenses. The Visigoths who sacked Rome, the Vandals who conquered North Africa, and the countless Germanic tribes that carved kingdoms from western territories found the Eastern Empire a far more formidable opponent. Protected by the narrow straits and blessed with more defensible frontiers, the Eastern Empire could concentrate its resources on maintaining Roman traditions while adapting to new challenges. The emperors who ruled from Constantinople developed a distinctly different character from their Western counterparts. Where Western rulers increasingly relied on barbarian foederati and Germanic generals, Eastern emperors maintained more direct control over their armies and administration. This difference would prove crucial as the 5th century brought unprecedented challenges to Roman civilization. No single construction project better demonstrates Constantinople's growing importance than the massive fortification system begun under Theodosius II in the early 5th century. The young emperor, guided by his brilliant sister Pulcheria and the capable Praetorian prefect Anthemius, recognized that Constantine's original walls no longer sufficed to protect the expanding city. The Theodosian walls, stretching nearly 4 miles from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn, represented the pinnacle of late Roman military engineering. Triple lines of defense rose from carefully designed foundations, with the inner wall reaching 40 feet in height and 12 feet in thickness. 96 towers punctuated these ramparts at regular intervals, each positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire against any attacking force. The middle wall, 30 feet high, created a killing ground between the outer and inner defenses, while a deep moat protected the entire system's eastern approach. These fortifications transformed Constantinople into the most impregnable city in the world. When Attila the Hun, the scourge of Europe who had brought Rome to its knees, approached these massive ramparts, he found defenses that even his legendary military genius could not overcome. The Hun army, which had terrorized populations from the Rhine to the Danube, looked upon those towering walls and decided to seek easier prey elsewhere. This decision validated the enormous investment in Constantinople's defenses and demonstrated to the world that the Eastern Empire possessed both the resources and determination to protect its capital. Within the protection of these barriers, the Queen of Cities flourished as never before. The population swelled to perhaps 500,000 souls, making Constantinople one of the largest urban centers anywhere in the contemporary world. This demographic explosion created unprecedented opportunities for cultural and religious development. Magnificent churches rose throughout the city to serve the spiritual needs of this Christian stronghold. The Church of the Holy Apostles, built by Constantine himself, became not only the burial place of emperors but the symbolic heart of imperial Christianity. Here, surrounded by the tombs of the 12 apostles, successive rulers found their final rest in a setting that proclaimed their role as Christ's representatives on earth. Dominating the harbor district, the Church of Saints Peter and Paul joined dozens of smaller churches serving individual neighborhoods and ethnic communities. Armenian merchants worshipped alongside Greek artisans, Syrian traders mingled with Gothic soldiers, and Egyptian scholars debated theology with Latin administrators. This cosmopolitan character distinguished Constantinople from more homogeneous cities and created a unique urban culture that blended Roman political traditions with Christian spirituality and Eastern commercial practices. The city's prosperity attracted not only merchants and craftsmen, but also the finest minds of the age. Schools of rhetoric, philosophy, and theology flourished under imperial patronage, making Constantinople a rival to Athens and Alexandria as a center of learning. The imperial library, housed in magnificent halls adjacent to the Great Palace, preserved countless manuscripts that would otherwise have been lost to barbarian invasions or religious controversies. As the 5th century drew to a close, Constantinople had achieved Constantine's vision of creating a new Rome worthy of the empire's eastern territories. The city commanded the crucial straits between Europe and Asia, dominated Mediterranean trade routes, and served as the undisputed center of Orthodox Christianity. Yet this success also brought new responsibilities and challenges that would test the empire's strength in the centuries to come. When Justinian ascended the throne in 527, Constantinople stood poised to achieve its founder's most ambitious dreams. This remarkable emperor, who would rule for nearly 4 decades, possessed a vision that extended far beyond mere survival or modest prosperity. He dreamed of restoring the full glory of Rome itself, with Constantinople as its magnificent heart. Born a peasant in a remote Balkan village, Justinian had risen through imperial favor and his own extraordinary abilities to become the most powerful man in the world. His court attracted the finest minds of the age, from the brilliant legal scholar Tribonian to the innovative architect Anthemius of Tralles. Most importantly, he married Theodora, a former actress whose intelligence and political acumen would prove essential to his greatest achievements. Together, this imperial couple would transform Constantinople into a city that rivaled anything the ancient world had ever produced. The emperor's first great undertaking was the complete overhaul of Roman law, a project that had languished in confusion for centuries. Working with teams of legal experts, Justinian ordered the compilation of all existing laws into a coherent system that would govern not just the empire, but influence legal thinking for over 1,000 years. This corpus juris civilis, as it became known, established principles of justice that still echo in modern legal systems across the world. But Justinian's most visible legacy was architectural, and nothing exemplified his ambitions more than the reconstruction of Hagia Sophia. When the original church burned during the Nika riots of 532, the emperor saw opportunity where others saw disaster. Rather than simply rebuilding what had been lost, he commissioned something unprecedented in human history. The architects Anthemius and Isidore of Miletus designed a structure that seemed to defy the very laws of physics. The massive dome, spanning over 100 feet in diameter, appeared to float weightlessly above the vast interior space. When sunlight streamed through the windows at the dome's base, the entire structure seemed to glow with divine light. Contemporary observers struggled to find words adequate to describe what they witnessed. The historian Procopius wrote that the dome seemed suspended from heaven by a golden chain, while others claimed that angels themselves must have guided its construction. The interior blazed with gold mosaics that depicted Christ in majesty, surrounded by saints and emperors in scenes of heavenly splendor. Precious stones from every corner of the known world adorned the walls, while columns of porphyry and verd antique marble supported galleries where the imperial court could observe religious ceremonies in appropriate magnificence. When the great church was finally completed in 537, Justinian himself is said to have exclaimed, "Solomon, I have outdone thee." This was no empty boast, for Hagia Sophia represented an achievement in engineering and artistry that would not be equaled for nearly 1,000 years. While transforming Constantinople into an architectural wonder, Justinian simultaneously launched the most ambitious military campaigns since the days of Trajan. His goal was nothing less than the reconquest of the western territories lost to barbarian tribes over the previous century. Under the brilliant generalship of Belisarius, imperial armies swept across North Africa, destroying the Vandal kingdom and restoring Roman rule from Morocco to Egypt. The conquest was so complete that the Vandal royal family was paraded through Constantinople's streets in a triumph that deliberately echoed the great victories of ancient Rome. Emboldened by this success, Justinian turned his attention to Italy, where Ostrogothic kings ruled from Ravenna. The Italian campaign proved far more difficult than the African adventure, requiring decades of warfare that devastated the peninsula. But when imperial forces finally entered Rome in 536, bells rang throughout Constantinople as citizens celebrated the restoration of the Eternal City to Roman rule. For the first time in over half a century, the Mediterranean was once again a Roman lake, with imperial fleets patrolling from Gibraltar to the Black Sea. Spanish territories were also recovered, giving the empire footholds on 3 continents and control over the most lucrative trade routes in the known world. This territorial expansion was matched by an extraordinary cultural flowering that made Constantinople the undisputed center of learning in the medieval world. The Imperial University attracted students from as far away as Ireland and Ethiopia, all eager to study under masters who preserved the wisdom of classical antiquity. Scholars working under imperial patronage copied and preserved thousands of ancient texts that might otherwise have been lost forever. Works by Aristotle, Plato, Thucydides, and countless other classical authors survived the Dark Ages precisely because Byzantine scribes continued to copy and study them in Constantinople's libraries. The city's workshops produced illuminated manuscripts of breathtaking beauty, combining traditional Roman techniques with influences from Persia, India, and beyond. Silk production, jealously guarded as a state monopoly, generated enormous wealth while providing the raw materials for textiles that were coveted throughout Europe and Asia. The famous purple silk reserved for imperial use became a symbol of ultimate luxury, while Byzantine gold coins maintained their purity and weight so consistently that they served as the international currency of choice from Britain to China. Yet even at the height of Justinian's achievements, careful observers could detect the seeds of future difficulties. The enormous cost of constant warfare strained the imperial treasury, forcing the government to impose increasingly heavy taxes on an already burdened population. The plague that struck Constantinople in 542 killed perhaps a third of the city's inhabitants, weakening both the military and the economy at a crucial moment. Religious controversies over the precise nature of Christ continued to divide the empire, with entire provinces remaining alienated from the imperial church. Most ominously, new powers were rising on the empire's borders, from the resurgent Persian Empire in the east to the expanding Arab tribes of the southern deserts. When Justinian died in 565, he left behind an empire that was larger and more magnificent than any since the days of Augustus, but also more fragile than its glittering surface suggested. Constantinople itself stood as the supreme achievement of his reign, a city that truly deserved the title of New Rome and would continue to dazzle visitors for centuries to come. The magnificent empire that Justinian had bequeathed to his successors would face challenges that would test every fiber of its strength and resilience. Within a generation of the great emperor's death, the Roman world would be transformed by forces that seemed to emerge from the very edges of the earth itself. The 7th century brought with it a storm that would reshape not just the Byzantine Empire, but the entire Mediterranean world. From the deserts of Arabia came a new faith and a new people, united under the banner of Islam and driven by a fervor that matched the early Christians in its intensity. The Arab conquests began as border raids, but quickly escalated into a systematic campaign that would strip away 2/3 of the empire's territory within a single century. Syria, the jewel of the eastern provinces, fell to the armies of Khalid ibn al-Walid after the devastating defeat at the Yarmouk River in 636. The loss was more than territorial, it was psychological, as the empire, that had considered itself the chosen vessel of Christian civilization, watched ancient Christian lands disappear under the Crescent banner. Egypt followed soon after, its vast wealth and grain supplies now flowing to Damascus rather than Constantinople. The Nile Valley that had fed Rome for 7 centuries was lost, forcing the empire to completely restructure its economy and food distribution systems. North Africa, where Augustine had written his great works and where Christian theology had flourished for centuries, was swept away in a series of campaigns that left only scattered Byzantine strongholds clinging to the coastline. Most shocking of all was the speed with which these ancient Christian populations accepted or adapted to their new rulers. The theological disputes that had torn the eastern provinces apart under Justinian had left many communities alienated from Constantinople's Orthodox Christianity. To these Monophysite Christians in Syria and Egypt, the Muslim conquerors often seemed preferable to the imperial officials who had persecuted them for their beliefs. The empire that had once stretched from the Euphrates to Gibraltar now found itself reduced to Anatolia, the Balkans, and a handful of islands scattered across the Mediterranean. Constantinople itself came under direct assault when Arab fleets appeared in the Bosphorus in 674, beginning a 5-year siege that would test the city's legendary defenses to their absolute limits. The secret weapon that saved the capital was Greek fire, a mysterious incendiary compound that could burn even on water, and turned the Byzantine navy into a force of terror on the seas. Ships approaching the Great Chain across the Golden Horn would suddenly burst into flames as streams of liquid fire poured from specially designed siphons mounted on Byzantine vessels. The psychological effect was as important as the military one, as Arab sailors began to speak of Constantinople as a city protected by supernatural forces. Yet even as the empire survived this existential threat, internal divisions threatened to tear it apart from within. The iconoclastic controversy erupted in the 8th century when Emperor Leo III banned the veneration of religious images, claiming that such practices violated biblical commandments and weakened the empire in its struggle against Islam. For over a century, the empire was convulsed by bitter disputes between iconoclasts who saw images as idolatrous and iconodules who viewed them as essential to proper Christian worship. Monasteries were dissolved, precious icons were destroyed, and families were divided as the theological dispute became entangled with political loyalties and social tensions. The controversy reached its peak under Constantine V, who pursued iconoclastic policies with such fervor that his enemies called him Copronymus, the dung-named, claiming that he had defiled his own baptismal font. Churches were stripped of their decorative mosaics and frescoes, replaced with simple crosses or secular imagery that seemed to drain the sacred spaces of their spiritual power. The resolution came only with the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, which restored the veneration of icons and established theological principles that would guide Eastern Christianity for centuries to come. But the damage had been profound, weakening the empire's unity and allowing enemies on all fronts to exploit Byzantine divisions. The 9th and 10th centuries, however, witnessed what historians call the Macedonian Renaissance, a remarkable revival that demonstrated the empire's extraordinary capacity for renewal. Under the Macedonian dynasty, beginning with Basil I, the empire launched a systematic campaign to reclaim its lost territories and restore its cultural achievements. The military reforms of this period created the theme system, which combined civilian administration with military organization in a way that made the empire's reduced territory far more defensible than the sprawling domains of earlier centuries. Each theme was governed by a strategos who commanded both the local forces and the civil administration, creating a system that could respond quickly to threats while maintaining efficient governance. The cultural achievements of this period rivaled those of Justinian's Golden Age, as scholars in Constantinople preserved and copied the works of classical antiquity that might otherwise have been lost forever. The University of Constantinople became the greatest center of learning in the Christian world, attracting students from across Europe who came to study Greek philosophy, mathematics, medicine, and theology. Photius, the great patriarch and scholar, compiled his Bibliotheca, a vast collection of summaries and excerpts from hundreds of ancient works, many of which survive today only through his careful preservation. Military success accompanied cultural revival as Byzantine armies pushed back against their enemies on every front. The brilliant general Nicephorus Phocas reconquered Crete from the Arabs in 961, ending a century and a half of Muslim control over the strategic island. His successor, John Zimisces, pushed even further, leading Byzantine armies deep into Syria and Palestine in campaigns that recalled the great victories of earlier centuries. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the empire might actually reclaim the territories lost to the Arab conquests. As Byzantine banners flew once again over Antioch and Damascus trembled before advancing imperial armies. Trade networks were rebuilt and expanded, connecting Constantinople once again to markets from the Black Sea to the Indian Ocean. The byzant, the empire's gold coin, became the standard currency for international commerce, accepted from Baghdad to London as a guarantee of purity and value. Yet even as the empire celebrated these remarkable achievements, new threats were gathering on the horizon that would prove even more dangerous than those it had already overcome. From the steppes beyond the Black Sea came the Pechenegs, nomadic warriors whose swift cavalry could strike deep into Byzantine territory before disappearing back into the grasslands. More ominously, Turkish tribes were beginning to coalesce under strong leadership, creating military forces that combined the mobility of steppe warriors with the discipline of settled armies. The Seljuk Turks, in particular, represented a new kind of threat, as they were not merely raiders seeking plunder, but conquerors seeking permanent settlement in the rich lands of Anatolia. When Romanus IV Diogenes led the imperial army to disaster at Manzikert in 1071, the consequences extended far beyond a single military defeat. The capture of the emperor himself sent shockwaves throughout the empire, while the subsequent civil wars between rival claimants to the throne left Anatolia virtually defenseless against Turkish settlement. Entire themes that had been the backbone of imperial defense were abandoned as their populations fled westward or submitted to Turkish rule. The empire that had seemed on the verge of renewed greatness suddenly found itself facing the possibility of complete collapse as Turkish emirates established themselves within sight of Constantinople's walls. Yet once again, the empire's capacity for survival and adaptation would be demonstrated in the face of seemingly impossible odds. The Fourth Crusade's conquest of Constantinople in 1204 created one of history's most unlikely imperial experiments. The Latin Empire of Constantinople, established by Frankish knights who had never intended to become Byzantine rulers, faced immediate and overwhelming challenges. Baldwin of Flanders, crowned as the first Latin emperor, found himself ruling over a population that viewed him as a foreign occupier rather than a legitimate sovereign. The Crusaders had seized the greatest city in the eastern Mediterranean, but they possessed neither the administrative experience nor the cultural understanding necessary to govern it effectively. The new Latin regime controlled only Constantinople itself and scattered territories in Thrace and central Greece. The rest of the former Byzantine Empire had fragmented into competing successor states, each claiming to represent the legitimate continuation of Roman imperial authority. In Nicaea, just across the Bosphorus from Constantinople, John III Vatatzes established what became the most successful of these exile governments. The Nicaean Empire, as historians would later call it, possessed significant advantages over its Latin rival. Its rulers spoke Greek, practiced Orthodox Christianity, and understood the complex administrative traditions that had sustained Byzantine governance for centuries. More importantly, they commanded the loyalty of populations who saw them as defenders of authentic Roman tradition against foreign usurpers. The Latin emperors struggled with chronic financial difficulties that made effective governance nearly impossible. The Crusaders had expected to finance their new empire through the wealth of Constantinople, but the city's economy had been devastated by the conquest itself. Trade networks that had connected the capital with markets across the Mediterranean had been disrupted. Many of the skilled artisans and merchants who had created the city's prosperity had fled to Nicaea or other Byzantine territories. The famous silk workshops, symbol of Constantinople's former prosperity, ceased production as their operators abandoned the occupied city. Islands in the Aegean were systematically recaptured by the Nicaean navy, which demonstrated remarkable resilience despite the empire's reduced circumstances. Most significantly, alliances with Bulgaria cut the land routes between the metropolis and the Latin holdings in central Greece, leaving the urban center increasingly isolated. These strategic victories gradually transformed what had initially appeared to be a hopeless situation into a realistic prospect for eventual restoration. Cultural and intellectual life during the occupation period reflected the broader decline of Constantinople under Latin rule. The university, which had been one of the glories of the old regime, virtually ceased to function as scholars fled to Nicaea or other eastern territories. Libraries were neglected or actively damaged, as Crusader clerics showed little interest in preserving manuscripts they could not read. The tradition of historical writing, which had produced masterworks like those of Procopius and Psellus, almost disappeared entirely in the occupied capital. However, in the scattered Byzantine regions, a remarkable cultural renaissance was taking place. Nicaean scholars, conscious that they were preserving the authentic traditions of the Eastern state, threw themselves into copying and preserving ancient texts. New theological works were produced that defended traditional Orthodox positions against Latin innovations. Even in the reduced circumstances of exile, the court maintained traditions of learning and artistic patronage that kept alive the essential character of Byzantine civilization. Theodore Civilascaris, who succeeded his father John Hasuri, proved to be not only a capable ruler, but also a distinguished scholar and writer. His letters and philosophical works demonstrated that intellectual sophistication could survive even in greatly reduced circumstances. More practically, he continued his father's policies of military and diplomatic preparation for the eventual reclamation of the metropolis. The preservation of Byzantine scholarly traditions during this period would prove crucial for the cultural revival that followed the restoration. Manuscripts copied in Nicaean scriptoriums preserved classical and patristic texts that might otherwise have been lost forever. The opportunity for reclamation came sooner than anyone might have expected. Michael V. Palaiologos, who had risen to power in Nicaea through a combination of martial skill and political cunning, launched the final campaign against the occupying regime. Rather than attempting a costly assault on the massive Theodosian fortifications, he relied on intelligence networks within the great city itself and the cooperation of the local Greek population who had never accepted Latin rule. On July 25, 1261, Nicaean forces under Alexios Strategopoulos entered the metropolis through the cooperation of Byzantine sympathizers within the garrison. The Crusader sovereign Baldwin VII fled so hastily that he left behind the crown jewels and most of the royal regalia. After 57 years of occupation, the Queen of Cities had returned to Greek hands. Michael Viri's triumphal entry into the reclaimed metropolis marked the beginning of the Palaiologos dynasty, which would rule for the remaining 2 centuries of the empire's existence. Yet the government that had been reclaimed was dramatically different from the one that had been lost. The population of the great city had fallen to perhaps a tenth of its former size. Vast areas of the urban space lay in ruins, their inhabitants having fled during the decades of Latin rule. The economic networks that had once made the metropolis the commercial hub of the Mediterranean had been permanently disrupted. More fundamentally, the balance of power in the region had shifted decisively during the Latin interregnum. Venice and Genoa now controlled most of the profitable Mediterranean trade routes. The emerging Turkish Beylik in northwestern Anatolia was rapidly expanding its reach and influence. Bulgaria had become a major regional power, while Serbia was asserting its independence under the ambitious Nemanjite dynasty. The reclaimed Byzantine state found itself surrounded by rivals and possessing only a fraction of its former resources. In the highlands of northwestern Anatolia, where Greek farmlands gave way to pastoral nomad camps, a new power was stirring that would reshape the world. Osman Gazi, leader of a modest Turkish Beylik, had begun something that his descendants would transform into the greatest Islamic empire since the early Arab conquests. What started as a collection of warrior bands seeking pasture and plunder gradually evolved into a sophisticated state that combined the martial traditions of the steppes with the administrative wisdom of settled civilizations. The descendants of Osman, named Ottomans for their founding patriarch, possessed advantages that earlier Turkish groups had lacked. Unlike the Seljuks, who had conquered vast territories only to see them fragment among quarreling successors, this dynasty developed institutions capable of sustained governance. They learned from their Greek subjects how to administer cities and collect taxes efficiently. From their Muslim neighbors came legal traditions and religious scholarship that would form the backbone of their expanding state. Most importantly, they created a unique military system that could both expand their borders and consolidate their conquests with unprecedented effectiveness. Orhan Gazi, Osman's son, established the foundations of Ottoman greatness during his long reign in the 14th century. He transformed what had been a loose confederation of tribal warriors into a disciplined force capable of sophisticated military operations. The capture of Bursa in 1326 provided this emerging power with its first major urban center, complete with workshops, markets, and the infrastructure necessary for a settled government. More significantly, Orhan began the systematic recruitment of young men who would become the legendary Janissary Corps. This Devshirme system represented a revolutionary approach to military organization that would give the Ottomans a decisive advantage over their enemies. Young boys, primarily from Christian families in the Balkans, were taken to serve the Sultan's court, where they received intensive education in Islamic law, Turkish language, and martial arts. Unlike traditional slave soldiers found in other Islamic states, these recruits could rise to the highest positions in the empire based on merit rather than birth. The Janissaries who emerged from this system combined absolute loyalty to the Sultan with professional competence that made them arguably the finest infantry force in the world. Their distinctive white felt caps and disciplined formations would become symbols of Ottoman military might across 3 continents. Across the narrow Dardanelles, the restored Byzantine government watched these developments with growing alarm. The Palaiologos dynasty, despite the heroic efforts of Michael Vusu and his successors, found itself caught between the advancing Turks to the east and an increasingly hostile Latin Europe to the west. Attempts to secure papal support through church union had alienated the Orthodox population without producing meaningful military assistance from Catholic powers. Venice and Genoa, the dominant maritime powers, showed more interest in profitable trade arrangements with the emerging Ottoman state than in defending Eastern Christianity. The Byzantines discovered to their horror that Italian merchants were actually financing Ottoman expansion by purchasing the spoils of conquest and providing the technical expertise needed for siege warfare. Murad I, who succeeded Orhan in the 1360s, proved to be the ruler who transformed a regional Anatolian power into a European force of unprecedented scope. His armies crossed into the Balkans, establishing a permanent foothold on European soil that would endure for more than 5 centuries. The victory at Kosovo in 1389, though costly in terms of casualties, eliminated Serbian independence and opened the path to further expansion northward toward Hungary and Poland. More ominously for the Greek capital, Ottoman forces now controlled both sides of the Dardanelles, effectively encircling the remaining fragments of the Byzantine Empire. The speed of Ottoman expansion reflected not just martial prowess, but also administrative sophistication that allowed them to govern conquered territories effectively. The reign of Bayezid I, known as Yildirim or the Thunderbolt, brought Ottoman power to the very gates of Constantinople. His lightning campaigns consolidated Ottoman control over most of Anatolia while simultaneously pushing deeper into the Balkans than any previous Turkish force. The siege of Constantinople from 1394 to 1402 demonstrated that the Ottomans now possessed the resources and technical capability to threaten even the most formidable fortifications in the world. Only the unexpected arrival of Timur and his Mongol forces, which devastated the Ottoman army at Ankara in 1402, saved the Byzantine capital from falling a half-century before its historical end. The temporary collapse of Ottoman power following Bayezid's capture created a brief respite for Constantinople, but it also revealed how completely the empire had become dependent on Ottoman forbearance for its survival. During the Ottoman civil war that followed, various claimants to the throne courted Byzantine support, demonstrating how thoroughly the balance of power had shifted. When Mehmed I finally restored Ottoman unity in 1413, he inherited a state that had learned valuable lessons from its temporary setback. The new Ottoman administration was more centralized, more professional, and more capable of sustained military operations than ever before. The development of Ottoman siege artillery under Murad II marked another crucial advancement in their military capabilities. Hungarian and Italian engineers, attracted by generous salaries and the promise of technical resources, helped create cannon foundries that produced weapons capable of breaching any medieval fortification. By the 1440s, Ottoman armies routinely deployed massive bronze cannons that could reduce fortress walls to rubble within days rather than months. The successful siege of Constantinople had become not a question of if, but when the Ottomans would choose to make their final assault on the last remnant of the Roman Empire. The morning of April 6, 1453, dawned gray and ominous over the Golden Horn as Sultan Mehmed II positioned his massive army before the walls of Constantinople. At just 21 years old, this remarkable ruler had spent years preparing for this moment, driven by an obsession that had consumed him since childhood. The young sultan possessed an intellect that astounded even his enemies, speaking 7 languages fluently and surrounding himself with scholars, engineers, and military advisors drawn from across the known world. His court included Hungarian cannon founders, Italian engineers, Greek scholars who had defected from the dying empire, and Islamic theologians who proclaimed his coming conquest a holy duty. Mehmed's preparations had been methodical and unprecedented in their scope. Throughout the winter of 1452, foundries across the Ottoman domains had worked continuously to produce the largest artillery pieces ever constructed. The most famous of these weapons, designed by the Hungarian engineer Orban, measured over 26 feet in length and could hurl stone balls weighing more than half a ton. The logistics of moving such massive cannons from Adrianople to Constantinople required the construction of special roads and bridges, while teams of hundreds of oxen strained to drag each piece into position. The Sultan had also commissioned the construction of a fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus, directly across from an existing fortification on the Asian side. This new stronghold, completed in just 4 months, effectively closed the strait to any relief forces that might attempt to reach the besieged city from the Black Sea. When Byzantine officials protested this construction as a violation of existing treaties, Mehmed's response was swift and brutal. Any Greek found within range of the fortress's cannons was immediately executed, sending a clear message that the time for diplomacy had passed. The Ottoman army that assembled before Constantinople's walls numbered between 80,000 and 100,000 men, supported by a fleet of over 100 vessels in the Sea of Marmara. This force included the elite Janissary Corps, seasoned veterans of European campaigns, irregular troops from across Anatolia, and specialized units of engineers and artillery specialists. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos faced the approaching storm with remarkable courage despite impossible odds. The last Roman emperor was a man of deep faith and unshakable determination, who had spent his brief reign attempting to rally support for his doomed capital. His appeals to Western Europe had yielded little beyond promises and small contingents of volunteers, while his acceptance of church union with Rome had alienated many of his own subjects. The city's population had dwindled to perhaps 50 Zalos and souls, defended by fewer than 7,000 fighting men, including a contingent of Genoese volunteers under the command of Giovanni Giustiniani. This brave condottiere had arrived with 700 men and immediately set about strengthening the city's defenses, particularly the vulnerable land wall where the main assault was expected. The massive Theodosian fortifications, which had protected the city for over 1,000 years, still presented a formidable obstacle despite their age and the damage inflicted by previous sieges. Constantine himself took personal command of the defense, appearing daily on the walls to encourage his men and sharing in their dangers with a heroism that inspired even his enemies. The emperor's speeches to his troops became legendary, reminding them that they fought not merely for a city, but for the survival of the last remnant of Rome itself. The bombardment commenced on April 12th with a thunderous roar that could be heard for miles in every direction. Mehmed's great cannons fired continuously, day and night, gradually reducing sections of the ancient wall to rubble despite the defenders' desperate efforts at repair. Each night, Byzantine work crews labored to rebuild what the Turkish artillery had destroyed during the day, using everything from marble columns stripped from ancient buildings to earth-filled barrels and wooden stakes. The psychological impact of the constant bombardment was perhaps as devastating as the physical damage, as the thunderous explosions shattered nerves and made sleep impossible for weeks on end. Turkish miners simultaneously worked to undermine the walls, digging tunnels that would allow them to collapse entire sections through the use of explosives. The defenders, led by a Scottish engineer named Johannes Grant, countered with their own mining operations, breaking into Turkish tunnels and fighting desperate, underground battles in complete darkness. Several Turkish assaults were repelled with heavy losses, as Greek fire and crossbow bolts took a terrible toll on attackers struggling to climb over the rubble of the damaged walls. The most audacious Turkish stroke came when Mehmed ordered his fleet to be dragged overland on greased logs, bypassing the great chain that blocked the entrance to the Golden Horn. This incredible feat of engineering allowed Turkish ships to attack the seawall, forcing Constantine to divide his already inadequate forces between multiple threatened points. By late May, both attackers and defenders were approaching exhaustion after nearly 2 months of continuous combat. The walls had been breached in several places, but each Turkish assault had been thrown back by the desperate courage of men who knew they fought for their lives and their faith. Constantine rejected Mehmed's final offer of surrender, which would have allowed him to rule the Peloponnese as an Ottoman vassal, declaring that he would rather die as emperor of the Romans than live as a Turkish puppet. The final assault began before dawn on May 29th, with waves of irregular troops, regular infantry, and finally the elite Janissaries hurling themselves against the weakened defenses. Giovanni Giustiniani, the hero of the siege, was mortally wounded early in the fighting, and his removal from the walls created a gap that Turkish forces quickly exploited. The breakthrough came at a small gate called the Kirkoporta, which had been left unlocked by accident or treachery, allowing a group of Janissaries to penetrate the outer defenses. Constantine XI, seeing that the end had come, removed his imperial regalia and charged into the thick of battle with sword in hand, dying as he had lived, as a Roman emperor. His body was never definitively identified among the thousands of dead that littered the streets and walls of his fallen capital. The last Roman Empire had ended not with surrender or negotiation, but with the death of its final emperor in hand-to-hand combat against overwhelming odds. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves throughout Europe and marked the definitive end of the medieval world, opening a new chapter in the long story of East and West. The morning of May 30, 1453, dawned over a city forever changed. Where the double-headed eagle of Byzantium had flown for over 1,000 years, the crescent moon of Islam now rose triumphant above the ancient walls of Constantinople. Mehmed II, now rightfully claiming the title of conqueror, stood amid the ruins of the last Roman Empire and began the monumental task of transforming his prize into the crown jewel of the Ottoman realm. The immediate aftermath of the conquest presented both opportunities and challenges that would test even Mehmed's considerable abilities. The city lay partially in ruins, its population scattered or dead, its great monuments scared by cannon fire and 3 days of looting. Yet beneath the destruction, the bones of one of history's greatest urban centers remained intact, waiting for a new master with the vision and resources to restore its former glory. Mehmed's first priority was establishing order and beginning the process of repopulation, unlike many conquerors who viewed captured cities merely as sources of plunder. The young sultan understood that Constantinople's true value lay not in its immediate wealth, but in its potential as the beating heart of a transcontinental empire. Within weeks of the conquest, he issued proclamations guaranteeing safety to any inhabitants who had fled, promising religious tolerance to Christians who submitted to Ottoman rule, and offering attractive incentives to merchants and craftsmen who would help rebuild the city's economy. The Sultan's approach to his new Christian subjects revealed both pragmatism and genuine respect for the civilization he had conquered. Rather than destroying the magnificent Hagia Sophia, he ordered its conversion into a mosque while preserving its essential architectural integrity. The Great Dome that had inspired wonder for nearly 1,000 years would continue to dominate the city's skyline, now calling the faithful to Islamic prayer rather than Christian worship. This symbolic transformation perfectly encapsulated Mehmed's broader strategy of synthesis rather than destruction. The Patriarch of Constantinople was allowed to retain his position and continue ministering to the city's remaining Orthodox population, though now as a subject of the Sultan rather than the Emperor. This arrangement, formalized through the millet system, would become a cornerstone of Ottoman governance, allowing religious minorities to maintain their distinct identities while contributing to the empire's prosperity and stability. The transformation of Constantinople into Istanbul proceeded with remarkable speed and efficiency. Mehmed imported skilled workers from throughout his domains, offering them prime locations and tax exemptions to establish their trades in the former Byzantine capital. Armenian merchants, Jewish refugees from Spain, Italian craftsmen, and Muslim settlers from Anatolia all contributed to the city's rapid revival, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that would define Istanbul for centuries to come. The Sultan's building program rivaled anything attempted by his Byzantine predecessors. New mosques rose throughout the city, their minarets creating a distinctive Islamic skyline while complementing rather than competing with the ancient Christian monuments. The Topkapi Palace, constructed on the site of the old Byzantine imperial palace, became a magnificent complex that housed not only the Sultan and his court, but also the administrative apparatus of an empire stretching from the Danube to the Euphrates. Perhaps most importantly, Mehmed recognized that Istanbul's greatest asset was its position at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. Under Ottoman rule, the city quickly reclaimed its role as one of the world's great commercial centers, with merchants from Venice and Vienna, Cairo and Crimea, all conducting business in its bustling markets. The customs revenues flowing through the Bosphorus helped fund the Sultan's ambitious military campaigns, while demonstrating that conquest could be more profitable than destruction. The fall of Constantinople triggered one of history's most significant intellectual migrations. Byzantine scholars, carrying precious manuscripts and centuries of accumulated learning, fled westward to Italian city, states where Renaissance humanism was creating new opportunities for Greek scholarship. These refugee intellectuals brought with them not only classical texts that had been lost to Western Europe for centuries, but also sophisticated understanding of Greek philosophy, theology, and literature that would profoundly influence Renaissance thought. Cardinal Bessarion, who had fled to Rome years before the final siege, became a central figure in preserving and transmitting Byzantine learning to the West. His personal library, eventually donated to Venice, contained thousands of Greek manuscripts that might otherwise have been lost forever. Other scholars found refuge in universities throughout Italy, where they taught Greek language and literature to eager students who recognized the value of this ancient wisdom. The irony was profound. The destruction of the last bastion of Eastern Christianity inadvertently accelerated the revival of classical learning that would help define the Renaissance and, ultimately, the modern world. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves far beyond the immediate region, reshaping global trade patterns and accelerating European exploration of alternative routes to Asian markets. With Turkish control of the traditional spice routes now complete, European merchants faced higher costs and greater uncertainties in their eastern trade. This economic pressure provided additional incentive for the voyages of discovery that were already beginning to transform European understanding of world geography. Within decades of Constantinople's fall, Portuguese navigators would round the Cape of Good Hope, Columbus would reach the Americas, and the center of global commerce would begin shifting from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. The Ottoman Empire's control of the eastern Mediterranean trade routes ultimately contributed to its own eventual decline, as European maritime powers developed alternative commercial networks that bypassed Turkish territory entirely. The conquest also marked a decisive shift in the balance between Christianity and Islam. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople had served as the eastern bulwark of Christendom, its survival offering hope that Islamic expansion could be contained and eventually reversed. Its fall demonstrated conclusively that the age of the Crusades was over, and that European Christianity would need to find new ways to define itself in relation to an ascendant Islamic world. The psychological impact of this realization would influence European attitudes toward the Ottoman Empire for centuries, contributing to both the fear and fascination that Turkish power inspired throughout the continent. Yet perhaps the most lasting legacy of Constantinople's fall was its demonstration that even the most enduring institutions could be transformed by historical forces beyond their control. The Roman Empire, which had survived barbarian invasions, religious upheavals, and countless military disasters, finally succumbed not to any single catastrophe, but to the gradual erosion of its foundations over many centuries. This lesson would not be lost on future generations of rulers who recognized that survival required constant adaptation to changing circumstances rather than mere preservation of ancient traditions. The final years of the Byzantine Empire unfolded like a Greek tragedy, with each act bringing the protagonists closer to their inevitable fate. By 1450, Constantinople resembled a magnificent ruin, a shadow of the great metropolis that had once commanded the respect and fear of the known world. Grass grew in the hippodrome, where 100,000 spectators had once cheered the chariot races with thunderous enthusiasm. Magnificent palaces stood empty, their marble halls echoing with memories of vanished glory and the whispered conversations of long, dead courtiers. Entire districts lay abandoned, their houses slowly crumbling as nature reclaimed what human ambition had built over centuries of imperial grandeur. The population that remained, perhaps 50,000 souls in a space originally designed for 500,000 inhabitants, clustered around the harbors and the great church, leaving vast areas of the urban landscape to decay in melancholy silence. What remained was still magnificent enough to inspire awe in foreign visitors who arrived expecting to find only ruins. Hagia Sophia continued to dominate the skyline, its great dome serving as a testament to human aspiration and divine inspiration that had survived 1,000 years of history. The Theodosian fortifications, though requiring constant maintenance that strained the imperial treasury to its breaking point, still presented a formidable barrier to any potential attacker. Most importantly, the spirit that had created this greatest of cities endured in its people, who called themselves Romans with the same fierce pride their ancestors had felt when the purple banners flew over Egypt and Syria. The imperial court reflected both the dignity of ancient tradition and the stark reality of contemporary circumstances that could no longer be ignored. The ceremonies that had once required hundreds of participants, elaborate costumes, and precious incense were now performed by a handful of elderly officials who remembered better days with bittersweet nostalgia. Regalia that had been crafted for rulers of vast territories, stretching from the Danube to the Euphrates, now adorned a sovereign whose actual domain extended little beyond the urban perimeter. These rituals continued with solemn dedication, maintaining the unbroken chain of legitimacy that stretched back through the mists of time to Augustus himself. The sovereign's greatest challenge was not defending ancient ramparts or maintaining empty ceremonies, but navigating the treacherous currents of religious politics that threatened to destroy Orthodox unity in the face of the growing Turkish threat. The question of union with Rome, which had plagued his predecessors for decades like a recurring nightmare, demanded immediate resolution as Islamic power grew ever more menacing on the empire's doorstep. Any decision risked alienating either the population whose loyalty was essential for effective defense or the Western powers whose military support might prove decisive in the coming struggle. Cardinal Isidore of Kiev, the papal legate who arrived in the metropolis in late 1452, embodied both the promise and the peril of assistance from the Latin world. A learned Greek who had embraced papal supremacy after years of theological study, Isidore brought with him both papal authority to proclaim church union and a small but determined contingent of soldiers to help defend the realm. His presence forced the emperor to confront the most painful dilemma of his reigns: whether to sacrifice the religious independence his people cherished for the military support they desperately needed. The proclamation of union in Hagia Sophia on December 12, 1452, marked both a triumph and a tragedy for the last Byzantine ruler. Triumph because it formally ended the schism that had divided Eastern and Western Christianity for 4 bitter centuries of theological disputes and political maneuvering. Tragedy because it also divided his own people at the precise moment when unity was most essential for survival. Many of the clergy refused to participate in the ceremony, viewing it as a betrayal of orthodox principles that their ancestors had died to defend. Ordinary citizens stayed away from services conducted according to the new arrangements, preferring to worship in private rather than compromise their faith. The famous declaration that it would be better to see the Muslim turban in the midst of the metropolis than the Latin mitre captured the depth of popular opposition to religious compromise. Meanwhile, across the narrow waters of the Bosphorus, Sultan Mehmed Al-Ure was transforming the Ottoman realm into a war machine focused on a single, obsessive objective. The construction of Rumeli Hisar had been only the beginning of preparations that dwarfed anything previously attempted in the region's long history of warfare. Foundries throughout the Islamic domains worked day and night to produce the artillery train that would reduce the ancient fortifications to rubble and dust. The famous Hungarian engineer Orban labored with dedicated craftsmen to create the largest cannon ever conceived, a bronze monster that would fire stone balls weighing more than half a ton. Ottoman preparations extended far beyond artillery into every aspect of siege warfare that military science had developed over the centuries. The Sultan's agents scoured Europe and Asia for specialists in mining, engineering, and professional troops experienced in urban warfare. Timber for scaling ladders and siege towers was cut in the forests of Anatolia and transported by ox cart to staging areas around the doomed metropolis. Most ominously, a massive chain was forged to stretch across the Golden Horn, cutting off the harbor that had been the urban center's economic lifeline for over 1,000 years. The recruitment of manpower for the coming campaign demonstrated the vast resources now at Ottoman disposal after decades of territorial expansion. Janissaries from the elite guard units converged on Adrianople for final training and equipment distribution under the watchful eyes of their commanders. Regular troops from across the European and Asian provinces received marching orders to assemble for what their leaders proclaimed as the greatest jihad of the age. Volunteer warriors from throughout the Islamic world, drawn by the prospect of participating in the conquest of Christianity's greatest stronghold, swelled the ranks to perhaps 150,000 men. Intelligence gathering had been as thorough as material preparation, reflecting the methodical nature of Ottoman military planning. Spies had mapped every gate and tower of the Theodosian barriers, noting weak points and defensive arrangements with meticulous care. They knew the exact number of garrison forces available, the quantity of supplies stockpiled within the metropolis, and the precise locations where the ancient fortifications were most vulnerable to concentrated attack. More importantly, they had identified potential collaborators within the empire itself through careful cultivation of contacts over many years. Merchants who feared for their property, officials who doubted the possibility of successful resistance, and religious figures who had been alienated by the union with Rome all represented potential sources of inside information. The diplomatic isolation of the Orthodox realm was now virtually complete, leaving Constantine XI without meaningful allies in his hour of greatest need. Venice, despite its Christian heritage and historical ties to Byzantium, had negotiated trading privileges with the Turks that made open support for the defense politically and economically impossible. The Venetian merchants in the metropolis faced an agonizing choice between their faith and their fortunes, knowing that resistance to Islamic conquest would likely result in the loss of both. Genoa's position was even more compromised, as their prosperous colony at Galata made them effective hostages to Turkish goodwill and military restraint. European powers showed little interest in providing meaningful assistance to the embattled realm, despite centuries of shared Christian heritage. France remained preoccupied with the final phases of the 100 Years' War against England, while the Holy Roman Empire faced mounting pressure from Islamic expansion in Hungary. England stayed focused on domestic affairs following the devastating Wars of the Roses, and even the papacy, despite its theological commitment to church union, could provide little beyond moral support and the small contingent of troops that accompanied Cardinal Isidore. As winter gave way to spring in 1453, the stage was set for the final act of a drama that had been unfolding for over a century as the last remnant of Rome prepared to face its ultimate test. The winter of 1452 to 1453 marked the final countdown for the last remnant of the Roman Empire, as Constantine X I Palaiologos faced the impossible task of defending Constantinople against overwhelming odds. With each passing day, the emperor's situation grew more desperate, as potential allies either ignored his pleas or offered only token assistance that would prove meaningless against the massive force assembling across the Bosphorus. The Holy Roman Empire, traditionally the most powerful Christian state in Europe, remained paralyzed by internal conflicts that prevented any meaningful intervention in Eastern affairs. Frederick III, though theoretically committed to defending Christendom, could barely maintain control over his own territories, let alone launch a crusade to save distant Constantinople. The German princes, exhausted by decades of warfare and religious controversy, showed no appetite for expensive foreign adventures that would drain their treasuries without offering tangible benefits. Venice, despite its extensive commercial interests in the eastern Mediterranean, calculated that accommodation with the rising Ottoman power would serve its trading empire better than a futile gesture of Christian solidarity. The Doge and his council had already begun secret negotiations with Mehmeti, seeking guarantees that Venetian merchants would retain their privileged status under Turkish rule. This pragmatic approach reflected the harsh reality that successful maritime republics survived by adapting to changing circumstances rather than clinging to romantic notions of religious warfare. Genoa, Venice's traditional rival, faced similar calculations and reached comparable conclusions about the wisdom of backing what appeared to be a losing cause. Hungary, the one European power that had consistently provided effective opposition to Turkish expansion, was now focused on defending the Danube frontier rather than distant Orthodox territories. John Hunyadi, though sympathetic to the plight of the last Byzantine ruler, recognized that his limited resources could not be spared for what appeared to be a hopeless cause. The memory of Varna, where the flower of Hungarian chivalry had perished in a failed attempt to halt Islamic expansion, made further adventurous campaigns politically impossible. The devastating defeat had demonstrated that even coordinated Christian resistance could not guarantee success against the disciplined Ottoman military machine. Within Constantinople itself, preparation for siege proceeded under conditions that would have been comic, if they had not been so tragic. The imperial treasury could barely afford to pay the few hundred professional soldiers who formed the core of the defense, forcing the emperor to seek loans from Italian merchants at ruinous interest rates. Weapons had to be purchased from these same merchants at inflated prices, as the city's armories contained mostly obsolete equipment unsuited for modern warfare. The great chain that had once protected the Golden Horn from naval attack required extensive repairs that strained both financial resources and engineering capabilities. Skilled craftsmen worked around the clock to restore the massive iron links, knowing that this ancient defense might represent the city's last hope of preventing a complete Turkish blockade. The spirit of resistance remained strong among those who chose to stay and fight, despite the overwhelming odds they faced. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese condottiere who arrived with a small force of professional soldiers, brought not only military expertise but also the international credibility that legitimized the defense in European eyes. His assessment of Constantinople's defensive capabilities was sobering yet honest. The ramparts were strong, but the garrison was woefully inadequate for the task ahead. Though his presence demonstrated that some Christians still honored their obligations to defend Christendom, Giustiniani's force numbered fewer than 700 men against an enemy that would soon field over 100,000. The Genoese commander's reputation for successful siege defenses gave hope to the defenders, even as his private correspondence revealed deep concerns about their chances of survival. Other foreign volunteers trickled into the city throughout the winter months, including Spanish hidalgos seeking glory, Italian adventurers drawn by promises of reward, and Orthodox pilgrims who refused to abandon the holiest city of their faith. These international fighters brought diverse military traditions and combat experience that enriched the city's defensive capabilities, even though their numbers remained disappointingly small. The Orthodox clergy, despite their continuing opposition to union with Rome, rallied to support the defense effort with unprecedented enthusiasm. Monasteries contributed their accumulated treasures to purchase weapons and supplies, melting down centuries-old chalices and religious ornaments to provide metal for cannon and shot. Monks joined the civilian volunteers who would man portions of the fortifications during the coming ordeal, abandoning their contemplative lives to take up arms in defense of their faith. Most importantly, religious leaders provided the spiritual leadership that sustained morale among a population that understood they were facing not just conquest, but the end of their entire way of life. The Patriarch of Constantinople, despite his theological differences with the emperor over church union, preached sermons that emphasized the sacred duty of defending the city that had served as the center of Orthodox Christianity for over 1,000 years. Popular resistance to the Turkish threat took forms, both practical and symbolic, throughout the winter months. Citizens melted down jewelry and church ornaments to provide metal for cannon and shot, while families that had preserved ancient traditions through centuries of decline now prepared to sacrifice everything rather than submit to foreign rule. Children were sent away to distant relatives in Italian colonies or Orthodox principalities, while their parents remained to face whatever fate awaited the empire. The winter months of 1452 to 1453 witnessed a curious calm before the storm, as Turkish and Byzantine forces maintained an uneasy coexistence. Merchants continued to trade across the lines, and diplomats exchanged messages about possible terms for surrender, though everyone understood that these negotiations were merely formalities. Mehmed I had committed too much prestige and too many resources to accept anything less than unconditional surrender, while Constantine XI had made clear that he would never abandon the city his ancestors had ruled for over 1,000 years. As spring approached, the tempo of Turkish preparations increased dramatically, with artillery pieces being moved into position along the landward side of the city. Engineers began the complex calculations necessary to coordinate a simultaneous assault from multiple directions, while the massive naval force assembled in the Sea of Marmara began moving toward the approaches to the Golden Horn. The final diplomatic exchange between the two rulers captured the essence of their respective positions, as Mehmed's demand for surrender was phrased in the formal language of Islamic law, offering the population safety in exchange for submission. Constantine's response, equally formal, rejected any compromise that would end the Roman line or surrender the city that bore the name of Constantine the Great. As April dawned, the greatest siege of the medieval world was about to begin. The morning of April 6, 1453, began with a sound that had never before echoed across the 7 hills of Constantinople. Urbana's great bombard spoke its message of destruction across the ancient fortifications, its voice a thunderclap that shattered the dawn silence and announced the beginning of the end. The Hungarian engineer's masterpiece, a bronze monster 27 feet long and requiring a crew of hundreds to operate, hurled its first stone ball against the ramparts that had protected the Queen of Cities for over 1,000 years. The impact shook buildings throughout the capital and announced to protector and citizen alike that this ordeal would be unlike any that had come before. The Turkish artillery train represented the most concentrated firepower ever assembled in medieval warfare. Beyond Urban's giant cannon, dozens of smaller pieces lined the landward approach to the metropolis, their bronze mouths pointing toward barriers that had turned back Attila the Hun and Arab caliphs. Each day brought a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction as stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds crashed into masonry that had weathered earthquakes and centuries. The ancient alternating courses of brick and stone, designed to absorb shock, cracked and crumbled under impacts that would have been unimaginable to the original builders. Sultan Mehmed al-Suli established his headquarters on the hill overlooking the Lycus Valley, where the land fortifications descended toward the Golden Horn. From this vantage point, the young conqueror could observe every aspect of the campaign while remaining close enough to the front lines to inspire his troops by his presence. His scarlet and gold pavilion, surrounded by the banners of provinces from the Danube to the Euphrates, became the nerve center for operations that involved coordinating land and naval forces across multiple fronts. Within the beleaguered metropolis, Emperor Constantine XI faced challenges that would have overwhelmed most rulers. His total garrison numbered perhaps 7,000 men, a pitifully small force to defend fortifications that stretched for miles. Professional soldiers formed only a tiny core of this defense. The majority consisted of citizens who had never held weapons in anger, monks who had exchanged prayer books for swords, and foreign merchants who had chosen to risk everything rather than abandon their adopted home. Giovanni Giustiniani emerged as the soul of the resistance, his expertise and leadership transforming a desperate situation into organized defiance. The Genoese condottiere established his command post at the critical section of the land barriers known as the Mesotechen, where the main Turkish assault would inevitably fall. His engineers worked frantically to repair damage from the daily bombardment, using timber, earth, and rubble to shore up breaches that appeared faster than they could be sealed. The great boom chain that stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn represented both the strongest element of the defensive system and its most vulnerable point. This massive barrier of iron links, supported by floating timber, had protected the harbor from naval attack for generations. Ottoman ships crowded the Sea of Marmara beyond the chain, their captains testing its strength while seeking any weakness that might allow them to force an entrance to the harbor beyond. Yet Mehmed Sikani possessed resources and imagination that previous besiegers had lacked. When direct assault on the boom proved impossible, the Sultan conceived an operation that would rank among the most audacious in military history. Throughout the night of April 21st, teams of oxen and hundreds of laborers dragged 70 Turkish ships overland from the Bosphorus to the Golden Horn, bypassing the boom entirely and establishing a naval presence in the harbor that had been considered impregnable. This maritime coup de main transformed the strategic situation overnight. Byzantine defenders who had concentrated their limited forces on the land barriers now faced attacks from the seaside as well. More critically, the appearance of enemy vessels in the Golden Horn demoralized the population who had believed their harbor sanctuary inviolable. Citizens who gazed out from their windows to see hostile ships where only friendly merchant vessels had sailed felt their world turning upside down. Daily life within the besieged capital took on a surreal quality as normal routines continued amid extraordinary circumstances. Markets still operated, though with diminishing supplies and soaring prices. Children still played in the streets, though their games now involved dodging fragments from cannonballs. Churches held services that combined traditional liturgies with desperate prayers for divine intervention. While outside their sacred spaces, the methodical work of destruction continued without pause. The bombardment followed a relentless schedule that wore down both stone and human endurance. Each morning brought renewed thunder as Turkish artillery resumed its systematic assault on the fortifications. Those manning the ramparts who had worked through the night to repair previous damage watched helplessly as fresh impacts undid their labor. The psychological impact proved almost as devastating as the physical destruction, as citizens who had never doubted the strength of their barriers saw them reduced to rubble before their eyes. Food supplies, carefully hoarded in anticipation of blockade, began to dwindle as the weeks passed. Bread became a luxury, available only to those with sufficient coin. Vegetables disappeared from the markets entirely. Even fish, traditionally abundant in the waters around the metropolis, became scarce as Turkish naval patrols restricted access to traditional fishing grounds. Hunger joined fear as a constant companion for the civilian population. Religious fervor reached fever pitch as the ordeal progressed. Processions bearing the most sacred relics wound through streets that echoed with cannon fire. The robe of the Virgin, preserved in the Blachner Palace for centuries, was carried along the battlements in hopes that divine protection might strengthen human defenses. In Hagia Sophia, Orthodox and Catholic clergy struggled to maintain the unity proclaimed the previous winter, while popular resentment against the union with Rome grew stronger with each passing day. Turkish mining operations beneath the land fortifications added a new dimension of terror to the siege. Sappers, many of them experienced miners from Serbia and Bosnia, dug tunnels designed to collapse sections of the barriers. The garrison responded with countermines, leading to subterranean battles fought in darkness by men who could barely see their enemies. The sound of digging became another source of anxiety for defenders who never knew when the ground beneath their feet might suddenly give way. The last days of May 1453 brought an almost supernatural tension to Constantinople as both besiegers and besieged prepared for what everyone understood would be the climactic battle. The great city that had stood as the eastern bulwark of Christianity for over 1,000 years now existed in a state of suspended animation, caught between its glorious past and an uncertain future. Within the walls, Constantine XI moved through his capital like a ghost emperor, visiting every section of the defenses one final time. The basileus had aged visibly during the siege, his face bearing the weight of responsibility for not just a city, but for the continuation of an empire that traced its lineage back to Augustus Caesar himself. He spoke personally with ordinary soldiers manning the walls, sharing their meager rations and listening to their fears with the patience of a confessor. These men, many of whom were foreigners who had chosen to stand with Byzantium in its darkest hour, represented the last flickering flame of Roman military tradition. The emperor's final inspections revealed the desperate improvisation that had kept the defense functioning despite overwhelming odds. Sections of the Great Wall had been patched with rubble from destroyed buildings, held together more by determination than engineering skill. Artillery positions constructed from marble columns torn from ancient monuments stood as testament to how completely the city had committed its resources to survival. Even the bronze statues of long, dead emperors had been melted down to provide metal for cannon shot, erasing the physical memory of the past to serve the needs of the present. Mehmed Su'i spent these crucial hours in his magnificent pavilion, surrounded by maps, reports, and the accumulated wisdom of his military advisors. The young sultan had staked everything on this campaign, understanding that failure would not only end his dreams of conquest, but might well cost him his throne. His father Murad II had twice besieged Constantinople unsuccessfully, and the Ottoman court contained many who whispered that the city was protected by divine providence and could never be taken by Muslim arms. The Sultan's final war council brought together the greatest military minds of the Islamic world, each offering their perspective on how best to breach the defenses that had protected the city for so many centuries. Zagin Pasha advocated for a coordinated assault from multiple directions, arguing that the defenders could not possibly cover every threatened section simultaneously. The experienced Halil Pasha, who had initially opposed the entire campaign, now grudgingly admitted that retreat was impossible and victory the only option that would preserve Ottoman prestige. Mehmed listened to all counsel, but kept his own plans largely secret, understanding that the element of surprise might prove crucial in the coming battle. The Sultan's preparations extended far beyond mere military considerations, encompassing the political and religious dimensions that would determine how history remembered this moment. Islamic scholars had prepared elaborate justifications for the conquest, arguing that Constantinople rightfully belonged to the Muslim world and that its capture would fulfill ancient prophecies. Christian populations throughout the Ottoman domains watched nervously, knowing that the outcome would determine their own fate for generations to come. As darkness fell on May 28th, Constantinople took on an otherworldly atmosphere that witnesses would remember for the rest of their lives. Processions of Orthodox clergy moved through the streets carrying icons and relics, leading prayers that echoed off the ancient walls like the voices of centuries past. The great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, filled with worshippers who knew they might never again hear the divine liturgy sung beneath its soaring dome. Catholics and Orthodox, who had spent months arguing over theological differences, now knelt together in prayer, understanding that sectarian disputes meant nothing in the face of existential threat. The last service held in Hagia Sophia, as a Christian church brought together representatives of every Christian community in the city, creating a moment of unity that transcended the bitter divisions that had weakened the empire for so long. Constantine XI himself participated in this final liturgy, receiving communion alongside common soldiers and foreign volunteers who had chosen to share the city's fate. The emperor's presence transformed what might have been a funeral service into something approaching a coronation, as if the entire Christian community was acknowledging him as their final representative before God. Outside the cathedral, families made their own preparations for what mourning might bring, hiding valuables, saying farewells, and trying to maintain some semblance of normal life even as the world they knew prepared to end. Children too young to understand the full implications of the situation sensed the adults' tension and clung more tightly to parents who struggled to offer comfort they themselves desperately needed. Women who had spent weeks carrying supplies to the walls now gathered in churches and homes, creating networks of support that would prove crucial in the chaos to come. The city's final night also witnessed remarkable acts of individual heroism and sacrifice that would have seemed impossible under normal circumstances. Wealthy merchants distributed their remaining stores to anyone in need, understanding that money would mean nothing if the walls fell. Scholars carefully hid manuscripts and books, hoping that future generations might recover the intellectual treasures of Byzantium even if its political existence ended. Artists and craftsmen worked frantically to complete projects they might never see finished, driven by an almost mystical compulsion to create beauty in the face of approaching destruction. As dawn approached on May 29, 1453, both armies completed their final preparations for a battle that would reshape the balance between East and West, Christianity and Islam, Empire and Republic. The defenders took their positions along walls that had protected the city for over 1,000 years, while the attackers prepared for an assault that would either crown Ottoman ambitions or destroy them entirely. In the growing light, the two forces faced each other across ground that had been contested for nearly 2 months, each side knowing that the coming day would determine not just the fate of Constantinople, but the future of two civilizations. History held its breath as two worlds prepared to collide in a battle that would determine the fate of the last remnant of Rome. Before dawn broke on Tuesday, May 29th, Sultan Mehmed Sili stood in his scarlet pavilion, gazing toward the ancient ramparts that had defied conquest for over 1,000 years. At 21, this young conqueror had staked his dynasty's future on these next few hours. Around the Sultan, commanders made final preparations for an assault that would either crown their master as heir to Caesar or destroy his reputation forever. In the pre-dawn darkness, 150,000 warriors prepared to test themselves against 7,000 defenders and the mightiest fortifications ever built. The Ottoman camp buzzed with nervous energy as soldiers performed their final ablutions and whispered prayers to Allah. Mehmed's battle plan combined centuries of Islamic military wisdom with innovations learned from European warfare. 3 successive waves would crash against different sections of the Theodosian barriers, each designed to exploit weaknesses created by the previous assault. First would come the irregulars and volunteers, expendable troops whose sacrifice would exhaust the garrison's ammunition and reveal defensive weaknesses. These bazooks included Anatolian peasants seeking plunder, Balkan Christians hoping to prove their loyalty, and dervishes eager for martyrdom in holy war. Anatolian regulars would follow, pressing the attack with disciplined fury. These Sipahis represented the backbone of Ottoman military power, professional soldiers who had conquered most of Asia Minor and much of the Balkans. Finally, the elite Janissaries would deliver the killing blow through whatever breaches had been created. These slave soldiers, raised from childhood to serve the Sultan, had never known defeat and wore their distinctive white felt caps with fierce pride. Across the Golden Horn, Emperor Constantine XI had made his own final preparations in the ruins of the Great Palace. This last sovereign of the Romans had spent the night in prayer at Hagia Sophia, receiving communion one final time beneath the great dome that had sheltered Christian emperors for 900 years. The ancient liturgy echoed through the vast space as priests and nobles joined their emperor in what many sensed would be their final act of worship in the cathedral of Eastern Christianity. Now, as enemy war drums began their ominous rhythm, Constantine donned simple armor and prepared to take his place among the common defenders who would share his fate. Giovanni Giustiniani had positioned his small force of Genoese professionals at the Mesotecan, the central section of the land defenses where Orban's great cannon had done its most devastating work. Around the Condottiere, Greek citizens who had never held weapons in anger checked their makeshift equipment one last time. Monks who had traded prayer books for swords blessed their comrades with trembling hands. Foreign merchants who had chosen to remain gripped unfamiliar spears with sweating palms. The defenders numbered fewer than 7,000 souls against an Islamic host that stretched beyond the horizon. At precisely 100 in the morning, the Sultan gave the signal that would change history. Across the Islamic lines, horns sounded the advance while kettle drums thundered a rhythm that could be heard throughout the besieged metropolis. The first wave surged forward like a human tsunami, accompanied by war cries in a dozen languages. Anatolian irregulars, Balkan volunteers, and dervishes seeking martyrdom in holy war struck the battered fortifications with fanatical fury. Initial resistance proved fiercer than the attackers expected. Despite weeks of bombardment, the ancient masonry still stood, and the garrison had used every hour to strengthen their positions with wooden palisades and earthworks. Greek fire arced over the ramparts, turning advancing warriors into human torches whose screams pierced the night air. Crossbow bolts and arquebus shots cut down the foremost assailants in bloody heaps. For 2 hours, this chaotic melee raged without decisive advantage to either side. The emperor himself appeared at critical points along the defenses, his purple cloak marking him clearly to friend and foe alike. Where the assault grew fiercest, there Constantine could be found, encouraging his men with words and personal example. Enemy arrows sought the sovereign constantly, but divine providence or simple fortune kept him unharmed as the battle reached its crescendo. As the irregular assault began to falter, Mehmed committed his second wave. These Anatolian troops represented the backbone of Islamic military power, disciplined forces who advanced in formation, their officers maintaining control even under the heaviest defensive fire. Giustiniani's leadership proved crucial during this phase of the battle. The Genoese commander seemed to be everywhere at once, plugging gaps in the defenses, rallying wavering fighters, and coordinating the response to each new threat. His professional eye could read the flow of combat, anticipating where the next crisis would develop, and positioning his limited reserves accordingly. Yet even heroic leadership could not overcome the mathematics of the situation. For every defender who fell, there were 20 attackers ready to take his place. Ammunition that had been carefully hoarded for weeks began to run low as crossbow quarrels and gunpowder supplies dwindled. Around 4 in the morning, as the second wave reached its crescendo, a crossbow bolt struck Giustiniani in the chest, piercing his breastplate and driving deep into his lung. The wound, though not immediately fatal, left the Genoese commander unable to continue fighting. As his men carried the condottiere away from the ramparts, panic began to spread among the garrison who had come to see their leader as invincible. The Sultan, observing from his command post, recognized the moment he had been waiting for. The Janissary drums began their distinctive rhythm, slower and more measured than the wild percussion that had accompanied the earlier assaults. These elite troops advanced with the confidence of men who had never known defeat, their white felt caps and flowing robes giving them an almost spectral appearance in the pre-dawn gloom. What happened next would be debated by historians for centuries. Somewhere along the northern section of the land defenses, a small gate called the Kirkoporta, used by the garrison for sorties against the besiegers, had been left unlocked after the last reconnaissance mission. Whether through oversight, treachery, or simple exhaustion, this minor breach in the seemingly impregnable defenses became the key that unlocked the greatest metropolis in Christendom. A handful of Janissaries led by a giant warrior named Hassan of Ulubat discovered the unlocked portal and forced their way through. Once inside, they fought their way to the main gate and opened it for their comrades. Within minutes, Islamic forces were pouring into the stronghold that had defied conquest for over a millennium. News of the breach spread faster than the invaders themselves. Defenders who had held their positions through hours of desperate fighting began to waver as reports reached them that the enemy was already inside the fortifications. The psychological impact proved as devastating as any physical assault, and the final act of this 1,000-year drama was about to begin. As devastating news of the breach spread through the defenders' ranks, the psychological impact proved as destructive as any physical assault. Men who had been prepared to die defending the ramparts lost heart when they realized the defenses had been compromised. Warriors who had stood firm through hours of desperate combat began to waver as reports reached them that enemy forces were already pouring through the ancient fortifications. The sound of Turkish war cries echoing from within the city walls created a terror that no amount of courage could entirely overcome. Constantine received word of the breakthrough while rallying the garrison near the central gate, where the heaviest fighting had been concentrated throughout the night. The emperor's response in this moment of ultimate crisis revealed the nobility that would transform him from a defeated ruler into a figure of eternal legend. Rather than fleeing to one of the Genoese ships that might carry him to safety in the west, Constantine chose to make his final stand where his ancestors had ruled for over 1,000 years. The decision reflected not just personal courage, but a profound understanding of what his survival would mean for the empire's legacy. To flee would be to abandon not only his subjects, but the very idea of Roman continuity that had sustained the empire through 15 centuries of triumph and disaster. Stripping away the imperial regalia that marked his exalted rank, Constantine took up sword and shield like any common fighter preparing for his last battle. The purple robes that had distinguished Roman emperors since the age of Augustus were cast aside in favor of simple armor that would not mark him as a target for capture. His last recorded words, spoken to his remaining companions, captured the profound dignity of his sacrifice with haunting clarity. "The city is fallen and I am still alive," he declared, acknowledging both the reality of defeat and his determination to share his people's fate. These words would echo through history as the epitome of imperial duty, spoken by a man who understood that some defeats are more honorable than any victory. Then, with a handful of loyal followers who refused to abandon their sovereign even in this darkest hour, the last emperor of the Romans charged into the Ottoman tide that was sweeping through his ancient capital. In the chaos that followed, as steel clashed with steel and the fate of empires hung in the balance, Constantine's personal destiny became lost to the confusion of battle. Some witnesses claimed the emperor fell fighting at the Sate Romanos Gate, where the heaviest assault had finally broken through the massive fortifications. According to these accounts, his body was so mutilated by enemy weapons that it could only be identified by the imperial eagles embroidered on his boots, the last remnant of his royal dignity. Others maintained that Constantine died unknown among the common defenders, his corpse never found among the thousands that would soon litter the blood-soaked streets of his capital. What remains absolutely certain is that the Roman Empire, which had endured for over 15 centuries through barbarian invasions, civil wars, and religious upheavals, died with its sovereign on the ramparts of its greatest stronghold. As Ottoman forces flooded through the breached defenses like a tide that could no longer be contained, the character of the battle transformed from organized resistance to desperate individual survival. The disciplined formations that had held the walls throughout the night dissolved into scattered groups of fighters, making their own decisions about whether to continue the hopeless struggle. Civilians who had placed their faith in the ancient barriers suddenly found themselves face to face with warriors drunk on victory and the promise of 3 days of sanctioned plunder. Houses that had sheltered the same Byzantine families for generations now echoed with screams as their occupants confronted the brutal reality of conquest. Children who had never known any world beyond the protected walls of Constantinople witnessed scenes that would haunt their memories for the rest of their lives. Hagia Sophia, the great church that had symbolized Christian power in the East for 9 centuries, became a desperate refuge for thousands of citizens who believed that divine protection would save them where human defenses had failed. Families crowded into the sacred space, pressing against the altar where emperors had been crowned and patriarchs had celebrated the divine liturgy for nearly a millennium. They prayed for a miracle that would turn back the tide of conquest, perhaps believing that God would intervene as he had during the Great Siege of 626 when the Avars and Persians had been mysteriously defeated. When the great bronze doors finally splintered under enemy axes, the sound marked not just the fall of a building, but the end of an entire age of Christian dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. Some defenders continued fighting even after the main defenses had collapsed. their courage unbroken despite the hopelessness of their situation. Venetian and Genoese sailors battled desperately to reach their ships in the harbor, knowing that the sea offered their only hope of escape from the conquered city. Greek fighters established last stands in isolated towers and strong points throughout the metropolis, determined to sell their lives as dearly as possible. Yet these scattered pockets of resistance, however heroic, could delay but not prevent the inevitable transformation of Constantinople into an Ottoman prize. By sunrise on May 29, 1453, Islamic banners flew from the ramparts that had protected the Queen of Cities for over 1,000 years, announcing to the world that the age of Byzantine glory had finally ended. The silence that descended upon Constantinople on the morning of May 30th, 1453 was unlike any the ancient city had ever known. For over a millennium, the Queen of Cities had awakened to the sound of church bells calling the faithful to prayer, the bustle of merchants preparing their wares, and the measured tread of imperial guards changing shifts at the palace gates. Now, an eerie quiet settled over streets still littered with the debris of conquest, broken only by the distant sound of Turkish soldiers establishing order in the districts they had claimed through blood and sacrifice. Sultan Mehmed Tabi'i stood in the courtyard of the great palace, surveying the prize that had cost him 53 days of siege and thousands of his finest warriors. The young conqueror, barely 21 years old, understood that military victory was merely the beginning of a far greater challenge. He had not endured the longest siege in Ottoman history simply to rule over ruins and ashes, but to claim the inheritance of Caesar himself and transform his conquest into the foundation of a new empire. The immediate aftermath of any medieval conquest typically followed a predictable pattern of destruction and plunder. Military law granted victorious armies 3 days of unrestricted looting, and Mehmed's warriors had certainly earned their reward through weeks of desperate fighting against seemingly impossible odds. Yet the Sultan possessed a vision that transcended mere military triumph, recognizing that the true prize lay not in what could be carried away, but in what could be preserved and transformed. Standing before the great portal of Hagia Sophia, the conqueror paused to perform a gesture that would resonate through the ages and demonstrate his understanding of the moment's historical significance. Bending low, he scooped up a handful of earth and sprinkled it over his white turban, a traditional sign of humility before Allah that reminded both his followers and himself that all victory comes from divine will rather than human ambition. Only then did he cross the threshold that separated Orthodox sanctuary from Muslim domain, entering the greatest church of Eastern Christendom with the reverence due to a monument of human achievement. Inside Hagia Sophia, shadows played across mosaics that had witnessed 1,000 years of imperial ceremony, their golden backgrounds catching the light that streamed through windows set high in the great dome. Shafts of sunlight illuminated scenes of Christ and the Virgin that had inspired countless generations of believers, while the vast space itself seemed to hold its breath as history pivoted on this single moment. The Sultan approached the altar not as a destroyer, but as a man who recognized the craftsmanship and devotion that had created such transcendent beauty. When Mehmed declared the profession of faith, his voice echoing through the immense interior, Hagia Sophia ceased to be a church and became a mosque through the power of spoken words rather than physical destruction. The transformation was accomplished through adaptation rather than demolition, a pattern that would characterize the Sultan's entire approach to governing his new domain. The mosaics would be covered with plaster rather than destroyed, preserving them for future generations while respecting Islamic prohibitions against figurative art in places of worship. The altar would be repositioned to face Mecca, and minarets would rise beside the ancient dome, but the building's essential magnificence would endure as a testament to human creativity, transcending religious boundaries. This symbolic conversion represented far more than a change in religious practice. It announced to the world that the Ottoman Empire would build upon existing foundations rather than sweep them away in favor of entirely new structures. Yet Mehmed's concerns extended far beyond symbolic gestures to the practical challenges of governing a city that was barely a shadow of its former glory. The Constantinople he had conquered bore little resemblance to the magnificent metropolis that had once commanded the respect and envy of the known world. Decades of decline had reduced the population to perhaps 50,000 inhabitants, scattered across neighborhoods that had once housed 10 times that number. Whole districts lay abandoned, their houses crumbling and their streets overgrown with weeds, while the harbor that had once bustled with merchants from across the Mediterranean echoed with an emptiness that spoke of economic collapse. The imperial palace itself, though still impressive in its architectural grandeur, had been stripped of much of its portable wealth during the final desperate years of Byzantine rule. To transform military conquest into lasting dominion, the Sultan would need to rebuild not just buildings, but an entire civilization from the ground up. The first challenge was establishing order among his own forces, who suddenly found themselves masters of unimaginable wealth accumulated over centuries of Byzantine rule. Churches contained treasures that represented the devotion of generations, while private houses held the savings of merchant families who had trusted in walls that ultimately proved insufficient protection. Without firm control, this windfall could have triggered chaos that would have destroyed what the conquest had won, turning victory into a Pyrrhic triumph that left the Sultan ruling over ruins. Mehmed moved with characteristic decisiveness to prevent such destruction, allowing the traditional 3 days of plunder before issuing strict orders that further looting would be punishable by death. Guards were posted at major monuments and religious sites, while the Sultan began the delicate process of transforming his army from a force of conquest into an administration capable of governance. The Sultan's treatment of the surviving population revealed both pragmatic calculation and genuine tolerance that was remarkable for its time. Rather than enslaving or expelling the Greek inhabitants who remained, he actively encouraged them to stay and participate in rebuilding their homeland under new management. Tax incentives were offered to artisans and merchants who would resume their trades, while safe conduct was guaranteed to those who had fled during the fighting and wished to return to their ancestral homes. Perhaps most significantly, Mehmed appointed Gennadios Scholarios as patriarch to head the Orthodox Church under his protection, an arrangement that preserved Eastern Christianity while acknowledging Turkish supremacy. This revolutionary system allowed the conquered population to maintain their religious identity while accepting political subordination, creating a model of governance that would characterize Ottoman rule for centuries to come. The economic revival of the conquered metropolis required more than good intentions and administrative reforms. Merchants needed security to resume trade routes that had been disrupted by warfare, while craftsmen required raw materials to restart production in workshops that had been abandoned during the siege. Farmers in the surrounding countryside had to be convinced that their harvests would not be confiscated by military governors more interested in immediate profit than long-term prosperity. Mehmed addressed each of these challenges with policies that balanced Islamic principles with practical necessity, recognizing that a thriving economy would serve his empire far better than a devastated wasteland. The transformation of Constantinople into the Ottoman capital would take decades to complete, but the foundation was laid in those first crucial months following the conquest. The young sultan who had dreamed of claiming Caesar's inheritance was beginning to prove that he possessed not only the military genius to capture the Queen of Cities, but also the wisdom to make her flourish once again under new masters. The conquest of Constantinople marked not an ending, but a magnificent beginning. Where others might have seen only ruins and devastation, Mehmed Sikirnai envisioned a capital worthy of his expanding empire. The young sultan who had dreamed of claiming Caesar's inheritance now faced the monumental task of breathing new life into the Queen of Cities. The transformation would require not just rebuilding, but reimagining what this ancient metropolis could become. The first priority was restoring the economic foundations that had made Constantinople the crossroads of the world. Agreements were negotiated with Venice and Genoa that restored commercial relationships disrupted by the conquest. These Italian merchants who had wavered between profit and principle during the fighting now found themselves welcomed back as valuable partners in reconstruction. Their ships would once again fill the Golden Horn, bringing goods from across the Mediterranean to markets that had stood nearly empty for months. The famous silk industry, which had been one of the pillars of the old economy, received particular attention from the administration. Skilled workers who had fled to Italian cities were offered generous incentives to return and share their expertise. Fresh workshops were established with government support, their looms humming with renewed activity. Within a few years, silk production had not only recovered, but exceeded its previous levels as Middle Eastern markets opened new opportunities for trade. The harbor facilities that had fallen into disrepair during the final years of Orthodox rule were extensively renovated. Shipyards were constructed that could build vessels capable of challenging Venetian and Genoese dominance in Mediterranean waters. Maritime affairs received particular attention from a ruler who understood that control of the Bosphorus gave him leverage over trade between Europe and Asia. Urban planning became another priority for the conqueror, who sought to create a worthy capital for his expanding realm. The Great Palace, damaged by neglect and warfare, was extensively renovated to serve as the center of Turkish administration. Mosques rose throughout the metropolis, their minarets creating a skyline that proclaimed the triumph of the faith. Gardens and fountains, following traditional architectural principles, brought beauty and tranquility to spaces that had been scarred by conflict. Perhaps most ambitious was the construction of Topkapi Palace, a vast complex that would serve as both royal residence and governmental center for centuries to come. Built on the site of the ancient Acropolis overlooking the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn, this architectural marvel combined Turkish design principles with the practical needs of administration. Its courtyards and pavilions would house a bureaucracy that governed territories from the Danube to the Indian Ocean. Religious architecture became a particular focus of the administration's building program. While Hagia Sophia remained the most prominent symbol of Turkish triumph, additional mosques were constructed that reflected distinctly Anatolian architectural traditions. The Fatih Mosque, built on the site of the Church of the Holy Apostles, demonstrated how Turkish architects could create buildings that rivaled the greatest achievements of their predecessors. Turkish architects, influenced by both traditional designs and the monuments they had inherited, created a distinctive style that would influence building throughout the Muslim world. Domes and minarets rose beside ancient columns and arches, creating a skyline that proclaimed both continuity and change. The intellectual life of the reborn metropolis flourished under Mehmed's patronage. The Sultan himself was a scholar of considerable accomplishment, fluent in Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Latin. His court attracted learned men from across the Muslim world and beyond, creating an atmosphere of cultural exchange that had been absent during the final decades of Orthodox rule. Libraries that had been scattered or destroyed during the conquest were gradually rebuilt and restocked with manuscripts from throughout the realm. Educational institutions played a crucial role in this process of cultural integration. Madrasas were established that taught religious law and theology alongside practical subjects like mathematics and astronomy. The old university, which had virtually ceased to function during the final years of Orthodox rule, was revived under Turkish auspices with a curriculum that included both religious and secular subjects. The demographic transformation of the reborn metropolis required careful management to avoid the ethnic tensions that had plagued other conquered territories. Greeks who remained were joined by Turkish settlers from Anatolia, Muslim refugees from territories lost to European reconquest, and Jewish families fleeing persecution in the West. This mixture of populations created challenges, but also opportunities for cultural synthesis that would define the character of the reformed capital. The administrative system that emerged from this reconstruction effort combined Islamic legal principles with practical adaptations to local conditions. The millet system allowed different religious communities to govern their internal affairs according to their own traditions, while acknowledging the supreme authority of the Sultan. Greeks could follow Orthodox canon law in matters of marriage and inheritance, Jews could observe their own religious practices, and various denominations could maintain their distinct identities. Cultural exchange flourished in ways that had been impossible during the final decades of Orthodox isolation. Turkish scholars gained access to Greek manuscripts that had been preserved in monastery libraries. Former Byzantine artists found patrons among Turkish nobles who appreciated their skills. Italian merchants discovered that Turkish rulers could be more reliable trading partners than the impoverished princes they had previously served. The palace culture that developed around Mehmed's court combined Turkish traditions with elements borrowed from both Orthodox and Islamic predecessors. Court ceremonies maintained the dignity appropriate to a successor of Caesar while incorporating the grandeur befitting the leader of the faithful. This remarkable transformation of Constantinople into the Ottoman capital would take decades to complete, but within just a few years of the conquest, the foundations were firmly established for what would become one of history's greatest imperial cities. When the great bronze doors of Hagia Sophia closed for the final time as a Christian cathedral on that fateful day in 1453, they sealed more than just a building. They marked the end of an era that had shaped the world for over a millennium. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves across 3 continents, creating ripple effects that would transform global politics, commerce, religion, and culture in ways that few could have imagined at the time. In the immediate aftermath of the conquest, thousands of Byzantine scholars, clerics, and nobles faced an impossible choice. They could remain in their ancestral city under Ottoman rule, converting to Islam or accepting the precarious status of dhimmi, or they could abandon everything they had ever known and seek refuge in foreign lands. Many chose exile, carrying with them treasures far more valuable than gold or precious stones. These refugees bore the accumulated wisdom of centuries, manuscripts that contained the philosophical works of Plato and Aristotle, mathematical treatises by ancient geometers, and theological commentaries that had shaped Christian thought for generations. Cardinal Bessarion, one of the most prominent Byzantine scholars to reach the West, established a virtual library of Greek learning in Rome. His collection of over 800 manuscripts became the foundation for Renaissance humanism, providing Western scholars with direct access to classical texts that had been largely unknown outside the Byzantine world. The printing press, that revolutionary invention of Gutenberg, ensured that this knowledge would spread far beyond elite scholarly circles. Works that had existed in only a handful of handwritten copies were suddenly reproduced by the hundreds, making classical philosophy and science accessible to anyone who could read Latin or Greek. Universities from Oxford to Prague expanded their curricula to include these rediscovered texts, while artists and architects drew inspiration from detailed descriptions of ancient techniques and designs. The intellectual awakening that we now call the Renaissance was profoundly accelerated by this influx of Byzantine learning. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople had served as the crucial bridge between European markets and Asian sources of luxury goods. Silk caravans from China, spice merchants from India, and traders carrying precious stones from distant lands had all passed through the city's bustling markets, paying customs duties that filled imperial treasuries and enriched countless middlemen. The Ottoman conquest disrupted these ancient commercial networks, not through deliberate policy, but through the natural consequences of political transformation. European merchants who had maintained trading posts and warehouses in the city found themselves operating under entirely new legal and religious frameworks. While the Ottomans generally welcomed commerce and trade, the cultural barriers and religious differences created uncertainties that made traditional routes less attractive to Western traders. Portuguese navigators, who had already been exploring the African coast in search of alternative routes to Asian markets, suddenly found their speculative ventures transformed into urgent commercial necessities. Prince Henry the Navigator's systematic exploration of the West African coastline, which had begun as an attempt to outflank Muslim territories in North Africa, now became a race to establish direct maritime connections with the source of Eastern luxury goods. When Vasco da Gama successfully rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498, he opened a sea route that bypassed Ottoman-controlled territories entirely. This maritime highway to India and beyond generated profits that dwarfed anything possible through traditional overland routes. Spanish expeditions, inspired by similar motives, stumbled upon an even more dramatic solution when Christopher Columbus encountered the Americas while seeking a western passage to Asia. The age of global exploration that followed can be traced directly to the commercial disruptions caused by Constantinople's fall. Nations that had once relied on Mediterranean trade routes now built oceanic empires spanning continents that previous generations had never imagined reaching. The religious implications of the conquest proved equally transformative, reshaping the balance between Christianity and Islam across vast regions. The Orthodox Church, suddenly deprived of its traditional imperial protector, found itself scattered across multiple political jurisdictions, while its spiritual center remained under Islamic rule. This dispersion created both opportunities and challenges that would influence Orthodox development for centuries to come. Russian princes, who had long claimed spiritual descent from the Byzantine emperors, now proclaimed Moscow as the Third Rome, destined to fulfill the Christian mission that Constantinople could no longer perform. Ivan III of Russia married Sophia Palaiologos, niece of the last Byzantine emperor, symbolically claiming inheritance of the imperial legacy. The double-headed eagle of Byzantium became the symbol of Russian imperial authority, while Orthodox monasteries in Russia assumed responsibility for preserving theological traditions that might otherwise have been lost. Catholic Europe responded to the transformation with a complex mixture of horror, opportunity, and strategic calculation. Papal calls for a new crusade to reclaim the former Christian stronghold generated initial enthusiasm among some rulers, but practical support proved limited. European monarchs, preoccupied with their own territorial ambitions and increasingly complex diplomatic relationships, proved unwilling to commit the resources necessary for such a distant and uncertain enterprise. The Protestant Reformation, which erupted just 64 years after Constantinople's fall, further fragmented Christian unity and made coordinated action against Ottoman expansion even more unlikely. Religious divisions that had once been manageable disagreements within a unified Christendom now became fundamental conflicts that prevented effective cooperation against external threats. The cultural synthesis that emerged from this religious realignment created new forms of artistic and intellectual expression throughout Europe. Renaissance artists incorporated Byzantine artistic techniques and motifs into their works, while theologians grappled with questions about Christian unity and identity that had been raised by the empire's demise. The conquest of Constantinople thus marked far more than the end of a medieval state. It represented a fundamental shift in the global balance of power, religion, and culture that would shape the modern world in ways that continue to influence international relations, trade patterns, and religious identity to this day. The Queen of Cities had fallen, but from its transformation emerged the foundations of our interconnected global civilization. The conquest of Constantinople in 1453 marked not merely the end of one empire, but the dramatic birth of a new world order that would reshape civilization itself. In the immediate aftermath of Mehmed Tivoli'in's victory, something extraordinary emerged in the transformed metropolis that created something unprecedented in medieval history. Under the new Ottoman administration, the former Byzantine capital became a cosmopolitan center, where scholars worked alongside administrators, where Jewish refugees from Spanish persecution found opportunities denied them elsewhere, and where Italian merchants traded alongside Arab financiers in bustling bazaars that echoed with dozens of languages. This multicultural flowering produced achievements in architecture, literature, and science that rivaled the greatest accomplishments of any previous era. The famous architect Mimar Sinan, whose works adorned the Ottoman capital throughout the 16th century, drew inspiration from both traditional Islamic designs and the magnificent architectural heritage he had inherited from Byzantine masters. His masterpiece, the Suleimani Mosque, demonstrated how builders could honor the past while creating something entirely original and breathtaking. The building's soaring dome paid direct homage to Hagia Sophia while incorporating structural innovations that would influence mosque design throughout the Islamic world for centuries to come. Yet the transformation of the Queen of Cities came at a profound cost that extended far beyond the immediate casualties of conquest. The unique civilization that had developed over more than a millennium, blending Greek learning, Roman law, and Christian theology into something entirely distinctive, vanished forever from the earth. Future generations would know this remarkable heritage only through books and ruins, never again experiencing the living culture that had connected the age of Constantine the Great to the final desperate days of Constantine XI Palaiologos. The strategic balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean shifted decisively in favor of the new Islamic Empire, with consequences that rippled across continents. Naval supremacy, which had allowed Italian states like Venice and Genoa to dominate Mediterranean trade for centuries, gradually passed to Ottoman fleets operating from their unassailable base at the Bosphorus. Hungarian resistance, which had served as the primary bulwark against Ottoman expansion into Central Europe, weakened significantly without the psychological support that the survival of the last Christian stronghold had provided to defenders throughout the region. Within a generation of the conquest, Ottoman armies stood at the gates of Vienna, the very heart of the Holy Roman Empire, threatening to sweep into Germany itself. Only the heroic defense led by John Sobieski of Poland in 1683 prevented Ottoman forces from advancing deeper into Christian Europe and potentially changing the entire course of Western civilization. The Siege of Vienna became a mirror image of the Siege of Constantinople, except this time, Christian Europe managed to save its most precious stronghold from Islamic conquest. The linguistic legacy of the transformation proved surprisingly durable despite the political upheaval. While Ottoman Turkish became the tongue of government and high culture in the transformed metropolis, the Greek language survived in neighborhoods and communities that maintained their ethnic identity under the flexible millet system of Ottoman administration. This linguistic preservation ensured that when independence movements emerged in the 19th century, they could draw upon unbroken cultural traditions stretching back through Byzantine times to the classical age of Pericles and Plato. Modern Istanbul, the direct successor to both the medieval capital and the original Greek settlement of Byzantium, bears the visible imprint of all the civilizations that have shaped its remarkable destiny across 3 millennia. Visitors today can see Roman cisterns beneath Ottoman palaces, Orthodox churches that became mosques, and medieval walls that witnessed the final stand of the last Roman emperor. The city remains what it has always been throughout its long history, a bridge between East and West, a place where different cultures encounter each other and create something greater than the sum of their individual parts. The memory of Constantine XI Palaiologos, the final emperor who chose death over surrender, became a powerful symbol of heroic resistance throughout the Orthodox Christian world. Legends grew around his final moments, transforming a historical figure into an embodiment of the values that his 1,000-year empire had represented to millions of believers. Whether he perished at the Seine, Romanus Gate, or died anonymously among his soldiers mattered less than what his sacrifice came to symbolize the principle that some things are worth defending even unto death. The scholarly debate over the conquest's historical significance continues to this day among historians and political theorists. Some argue that it marked the definitive end of the medieval period and the beginning of the modern era of nation, states, and global exploration. Others contend that it represented merely one dramatic event in the long, continuous transformation of human civilization. What cannot be disputed is that the end of the final remnant of Rome marked a crucial turning point, after which the political and cultural landscape of the world was fundamentally different. The Queen of Cities endures today, more beautiful and populous than ever before in its long history. The Bosphorus still carries ships between Europe and Asia, connecting civilizations as it has for millennia. The Golden Horn still shelters vessels from across the globe in its protected waters. Hagia Sophia, now once again serving as a mosque after briefly functioning as a museum, continues to inspire awe in visitors who stand beneath its magnificent dome and contemplate the layers of history it represents. Yet something irreplaceable was lost on that fateful May morning, when the final Roman emperor perished defending walls that had protected his ancestors for over 1,000 years. The ancient dream of Rome, that powerful ideal of universal dominion under divine sanction, died with Constantine XI in the rubble of his capital. Never again would rulers claim with credibility to be the direct successors of Caesar and Augustus, inheritors of an unbroken imperial tradition stretching back to the foundation of the eternal city. The world had become a more complicated and fragmented place, divided among competing states and nations that acknowledged no universal earthly authority above their own sovereignty.